Throughout human history, one thing has been a constant: crime. There are many types of crimes committed and many types of investigators who look into them. Criminals get very creative to stay ahead of the law. Find out crime doesn't pay. Join Jason Esty as he dissects various crimes, mysteries, and disappearances.
Crime Maze.
Hello, my amazing YouTubers everywhere. Boy, do you look beautiful. You really do. And guess what? You're watching and listening to Jason. Of course, I go by ESTEY'S Crime Maze. Thank you so much for being here. Welcome to all my new people as well to my channel. And of course, sincere thank you to all of you that have already subscribed. The channel's taking off. I've just got a lot of new subscribers just in the last 24 hours. It's unbelievable. Lots of comments on my last video. Check it out, everyone. But today, I want to discuss with you about, the Karen Read trial. This other crazy case in Boston, Massachusetts, right? That took place January 28th, 2022. Oh, but just before we go on, everyone, if you think I have value to share with humanity, if you enjoy my videos, you know what I'm about to say, right? I hope you'll subscribe. Again, I hope you smash that like button. It all helps with the algorithms, apparently, as well as hitting that bell icon. You get to be notified for future videos. And feel free to leave me a comment, everyone. I read them, okay? And again, really, really appreciate it. So, without further ado, what trial am I talking about? Again, the Karen Read trial. Again, it took place, right, January 28th, 2022. This financial executive went out, first of all, her boyfriend, of course, was John O'Keefe. By all accounts, overall, he was a great man. And, we all have certain flaws in our personality, but John was an absolute outstanding man. He was, he was looking after kids that were not even his own. I mean, it's a long story, everyone, but just understand, he was a super guy. He was really showing a lot of maturity, a lot of caring and thoughtfulness, and sharing his time with these kids, educating them, being a parent, being a father to these wonderful children. And he was trying overall to be a great boyfriend, I believe, in a relationship with Karen Read. And, a lot of people say it was a toxic relationship, and maybe at times it was. It sounds like it wasn't the healthiest of all relationships. And that's what happens a lot when both partners are drinking a lot, I would argue too, right? So, and I think this case involves obviously alcohol. A lot of alcohol, right, everyone? Because the moral of the story is Karen Read, maybe that's not the right terminology, moral of the story, but one of the main data points you could say is, my friends, it involves almost everyone in the story almost. And in this trial, they're all drinking. It's incredible, right? Karen dropped off her boyfriend, first of all, her and her boyfriend, John O'Keefe, were at the Waterfalls bar. I believe it's called the Waterfall, right? And we'll go over the times of all this happening, everyone. I think it was around 12:30 at night or something. Or even a little bit sooner. Anyway, they were at the Waterfall bar. By all accounts, on the video evidence, it shows it wasn't as if Karen and John were fighting at that time. They were lovey-dovey. They were having a good time. Karen was in good spirits. John was, they were celebrating. They were having drinks, having a good time. And of course, there were cops at this Waterfall bar, right? Or I think there was. But anyway, they also went to an after-hour bar later. John O'Keefe did, and Karen, and that's when there were more cops at this bar. So let's get into it, everyone, because of course, anyone that's familiar with this case understands now. There was a first trial that took place, right? What was it, last year or something? Hopefully, I'll get the dates. Feel free to leave me in a comment, everyone. And now the second trial has happened. Okay? And now the second trial's just finished.
Mr. Foreman, on docket number 2282-CR117001, murder in the second degree, what say you? Is the defendant at the bar guilty or not guilty?
Not guilty.
So say you, Mr. Foreman? So say you? No. Do you agree? Yes. Do all of you agree? Yes. Thank you. 002. What say is the defendant at the bar not guilty or guilty?
Not guilty.
Of.
Is not guilty or guilty about that charge or any lesser included charge? Thank you. Specifically, number 5, operating under the influence of liquor by operating a motor vehicle with a blood alcohol level of 0.08 or greater. Correct?
Yes.
So say you, Mr. Foreman?
Guilty.
So say you all?
Yes. Guilty.
003. What say is the defendant at the bar leaving the scene after accident resulting in death? The defendant not guilty or guilty?
Not guilty.
So say you, Mr. Foreman? So say you all? Jurors, hearken your verdict as the court records that you upon your oath say the defendant on 001 is not guilty, on 002 is guilty of operating under the influence of liquor, and 003 not guilty. Thank you.
The first one was in a hung jury, I guess, a mistrial, right? So, let's get into it, everyone, because, again, anybody familiar with the case, but people new to the case, I'll just tell you, Karen Reed, the prosecution, the state, claims that Karen Reed hit, on purpose, by the way, hit John O'Keefe with her big SUV, because poor John O'Keefe was found almost dead on the lawn of Brian Albert's house on his property, right? And there was this big party with all these cops and other family of these cops. It was Brian Albert, I believe, house. And John O'Keefe was found mortally wounded on the lawn, my friends, almost completely dead. Yes. But the state wants you to believe, apparently they think that Karen hit John O'Keefe and that John never made it inside the house, that Karen backed up at 24, miles per hour in a drunken rage and smashed, clipped John O'Keefe, unfortunately. Did that happen, my friends? Did that happen? We're going to get into it. I think it very well may have. I think this just be, if I were to bet right now, I'll just tell you, my friends, my theory, I think unfortunately, I think it's more likely that Karen, it is a case of just, it's a very unsexy theory, but I think it's another case of drunken driving, everyone. I really do. I don't think Karen most likely intended to do it. I don't think she was in such a drunk rage that she wanted to clip John with her SUV. That doesn't make much sense, does it, everyone? She'd have to be completely psycho. But I do think that Karen, being drunk, she backed up and didn't see John and clipped him. Although the medical examiners, my friends, and in future videos we'll get into this more, but all the medical examiners apparently, they don't believe that the injuries to John O'Keefe are indicative of a car accident. And it is very strange. I mean, there were no broken bones. The x-rays just came out, everyone. The actual defense team showed you, and we'll go over her name in a moment maybe, but she showed you, she looked at the x-rays, there were no broken pelvis, there was no broken fingers or showing an x-ray of broken bones in John O'Keefe's right arm. Because remember, everyone, John O'Keefe's right arm it looked like scratch marks. Everybody says it looks like a dog scratched or bit puncture wounds in his arm. It sure looks like that. Doesn't mean it was for sure. We don't know, everyone. Here's the other thing what makes it complicated, because you can't test nobody's going to test a live human being with a vehicle backing up at 24, 23 miles per hour and, have some, a dummy, a live person being clipped to see what injuries and have the exact same vehicle. Because we don't know, everyone. We don't know if Karen's vehicle could have had, with those type of lights, could it have caused those lacerations on the arm of John O'Keefe? Not to mention hitting the back of his head, because there was a massive skull fracture. See, that's the other thing, everyone, that leads me to believe that Karen clipped John. That she actually caused this fatality, because even though everybody keeps saying, and the medical examiners, there were no broken bones. But that's not accurate, my friends, is it? Because he did have a broken bone. Not on his arm, where you would think there would be, and there was no bruising, by the way. That's very, very unusual. It's really unheard of in a car accident similar to this, everyone. But there was a broken bone. Again, not on his right arm, but guess where it was? It was on his head, in his head, because he had a skull fracture, my friends. Can't that be indicative of a car accident? Of course it can, right? Car accidents, I'm sure a lot of times you're going to have skull fractures in a major accident. So anyway, I want to read you something that I think you might find very interesting, my friends. One of many thousands of posts on Reddit that I read. I didn't read thousands, but I want to read you this one that I read, my friends, because I think it's quite interesting. Hopefully I can read you my own handwriting. And again, thank you for being with me, everyone. And I know a lot of you really are enthralled with this fascinating Karen Read trial and the case, and the second trial, as I said now, that just finished. Feel free to leave me a comment again, everyone. I really appreciate it, and I will read them, okay? It says, in this article, it says, the 45-year-old is accused of hitting her police officer boyfriend with her SUV and leaving him to die in the snow. The defense says she dropped John O'Keefe off at a party that night and is being framed in a cover-up. Here are the basics. Karen Read is a 44-year-old equity analyst and professor who is living in Canton, Massachusetts. Her boyfriend, John O'Keefe, who was a Boston police officer, and on the night of January 28, 2022, she went out with O'Keefe, his cop friends, and their wives, and they all got very drunk. She's definitely hammered when she drove O'Keefe to an after party at the home of Brian Albert, the police sergeant detective who worked with O'Keefe at the Boston Police Department. What happens next is the subject of debate. It certainly is. And this forthcoming trial, the prosecution thinks she backed into him and killed him outside Brian Albert's home, while the defense is alleging that she dropped him off. And he went inside the home and walked, sorry, my friends, the cat just hit this camera. Anyway, sorry, my friends. Let me read this again, my friends, this part. She was definitely hammered when she drove O'Keefe to an after party at the home of Brian Albert, the police sergeant detective who worked with O'Keefe at the Boston Police Department. What happens next is the subject of the debate and this forthcoming trial. The prosecution thinks she backed into him and killed him outside of Brian Albert's home, while the defense is alleging that she dropped him off and he went inside the home and was killed either by Brian Albert's dog or by the Brian Albert's relatives. We do know, that when she wakes up at O'Keefe's place at 5 a.m. or so, she frantically calls some of the other women that had been partying with her. Brian didn't arrive home late last night, she told them, and her memory of the night before is bad, so she's worried he might be dead. I know, yikes, the person writes. Together they go looking for him. So I'm just going to straighten this camera out a little bit again, my friends. Together they go looking for him, and when they arrive outside the home of Brian Albert, soon Karen spots John's cold body and covered under 6 inches of snow. She lies on top of him and tries to give him CPR, and she calls 911. These are all facts of the case, everyone. Okay, that's all come to the forefront here. When the paramedics arrived, she said something like, I hit him, or could I have hit him? And by the way, she said this in her interviews, everyone. Let's go on here, everyone. She says, and she tried to give him CPR. She called 911. When the paramedics arrived, she said something like, I hit him, or I could have hit him. As soon after that, she was brought to the hospital to have blood drawn, which, and then they said that she had a BAC of 0.08, or meaning she would have been much more intoxicated, possibly between 0.13 or 0.29 when she was driving away at 12:30 a.m. or so. Later that day, investigators find pieces of taillight on the snow, and at some point they find pieces of taillight in the dirt. or in his shirt, pardon me. This doesn't look good for Reed. Why is the car missing some of its taillight? And those are great questions, everyone. She's arrested 3 days after his body is found. The prosecution's theory is basically that she dropped him off, and while she was behind her car, she backed into him in a fit of rage and left him there to die. The case against her is pretty strong, and she was obviously insanely drunk, so much so that her BAC was still or above the legal limit at around 9 a.m., and it isn't exactly promising that she wondered, as I said earlier, my friend, she wondered loudly if she had been the one who hit her boyfriend, which she apparently did to both the women that were helping her and the paramedics. So again, my friends, the prosecution is trying to use Karen Reed's own words as part of the evidence here, everyone, and I think rightly so from the prosecution. And it goes on. Plus, the relationship had been having problems. According to O'Keefe's niece and nephew who lived with the couple, the two had been fighting a lot, and they were toxic and had a toxic relationship. It's easy to see how that could have been at play that night. John O'Keefe died after she dropped him off that night. It seems she left a voicemail on his phone where she screamed, "I hate you," which is sort of something you say if you have a drunken rage, or drunken streak, it says. And then there's the taillight, which seems to indicate that some sort of collision happened between her car. John O'Keefe in front of Brian Albert's house. But the case is weird. To a lot of people, the photos from O'Keefe's autopsy just don't look like someone who was hit by a car. And I agree, everyone. In fact, officials initially suspected they had been hit violently by a glass. That he had been hit violently by a glass. Sorry, John O'Keefe, right? Most of the lacerations, swelling, broken bones are in his head, which has a lot of people think it's hard to explain if he was back-ended, hit by a car, which would more likely hit him at his midsection. And then there's marks on his arm that looks like, that he was bit by a dog. Because Brian Albert, my friends, you'll find out, he had a dog named Chloe, a big female German Shepherd, who apparently wasn't good with people, right? Attacked people at times. Oh, and by the way, my friends, so much weird behavior that we'll talk about in future videos where apparently Brian Albert, right, shortly after the incident of John O'Keefe, having his body found on the front lawn. And by the way, Brian Albert, my friends, when the paramedics arrived, you had so many sirens going on and paramedics and Karen screaming and other people yelling, so much commotion, noise, and Brian Albert still didn't come out the front of his house, my friends, or his wife. Are you kidding me? And of course, Brian had no good explanation for that, my friends. He lied saying he was sleeping and just nonsense. Of course, anybody, in their right mind would have come out to check on their buddy, a fellow police officer and there's all these paramedics and people out front of your house. But then again, my friends, right? Do we really know how we would react? If you were a police officer and you found another police officer, your buddy, on the front of your line, and you got all these other police and paramedics out front, maybe you'd be in such a shock phase, maybe you would make a terrible misjudgment and stay in your house. Maybe it shows that Brian Albert was scared shitless and he made a poor decision, my friends, and he stayed in his house. Again, instead of trying to maybe give aid, because he was trained in CPR, as many people have said, right? But, it's hard to say how we would react in these situations. We hope we would do the right thing and come out front of the house in this case, right, everyone? And try to give John O'Keefe, for example, assistance. Anyway, let's go on here, everyone. It says, again, according to O'Keefe's niece and nephew, who lived with the couple, the two had been fighting a lot, a toxic relationship. It's easy to see how this could have been at play right before John O'Keefe died, after she dropped him off that night. It seems she left a voicemail on his phone where she screamed, "I hate you," which is sort of the thing you would say if you have a drunken rage streak. And then there's the tail light, which seems to indicate that some sort of collision happened between your car, John O'Keefe hit in front of Brian Albert's house. But this case is weird. To a lot of people, oh yeah, and I said this about the autopsies, my friends, it didn't show as if like a vehicle, hit another person, because there were no broken bones in his midsection. There was no bruising. But again, there was broken bones. The poor guy had a skull fracture, which was deadly at the back of his head, my friends, okay? The Alberts actually did have a big German Shepherd who had supposedly attacked people. That's what I said before, my friends. The dog's name was Chloe. And it abruptly and Brian Albert, as the comment says here, the Alberts abruptly got rid of the dog, my friends. Is this just coincidence? And not only did they get rid of the German Shepherd, which is very unusual when you have a family pet for many years, as they did, but they renovated their basement and they sold the house. What, several months or a year later or something? Is this all just coincidence? I mean, you gotta wonder, everyone. Very, very strange. And then, given that the case was in Boston suburbs and involved Boston police officers, where police have been historically been notoriously corrupt, people in Reed's Corner started to look. And then first it says a lot of the case for Karen Reed's innocence strains credulity, I think is the word. And many of the people alleging a police cover-up are not the most likable or trustworthy of sorts, this person writes. I don't think I agree with that statement there, but it seems like her lawyer has a flair for the drama. He has worked on several seedy but high-profile Hollywood cases. Well, I love Alan Jackson, my friends. He used to be a former prosecutor, now turned defense lawyer. But Alan Jackson's the real deal, my friends. And yeah, he has a job to do. He has to try to add drama. He's got a flair for it. Why not? And he's got to try to spin it, to try to show at times, well, maybe it was a conspiracy. But my friends, I don't know if I agree with Alan Jackson here. After the first, in the first trial, he tried to talk about the Alberts and getting them on the stand, right? And in his closing, he talked about a possible conspiracy here with the cops. Well, in the second trial, the big difference in the closing hearings in particular, my friends, Alan Jackson, the defense team, chose to not talk about a possible conspiracy. They didn't put the Alberts in the view of, a possible actual crime where they murdered John O'Keefe, right? Instead, what did they do? They kept it short and simple. Alan Jackson still had a lot to say, my friends, but Alan just kept it simple. All he kept saying was there was no collision, right? Karen Reed never hit John O'Keefe. So I guess the defense team, Alan Jackson's hoping that the jury will try to use their own reason, logic, common sense, and speculation, I guess, and think, well, if Karen didn't hit him, I guess, we don't have to prove who else may have killed John. Maybe it was a conspiracy with the cops. We don't know. But Alan Jackson has shown there is not enough evidence to show that Karen hit John O'Keefe. She didn't hit him. So that's what the defense team for Karen Reed and Karen Reed are hoping for, my friends. But I don't know if that was the right approach in the end by Alan Jackson, my friends, the defense team. So again, my friends, it says here, it seems like our lawyer has a flair for the drama, as I said earlier, and worked on several seedy but high-profile Hollywood cases. And it also seems like Reed has been encouraging Eldon Kenny, the blogger who's been covering this case in great detail, but also tends to make massive leaps in his reasoning, some of which are as stupid as Karen Reed was well off and classy. It would never do such a thing, and has been harassing and bullying people involved, so much so that he was arrested for intimidating witnesses. So the person's referring to Turtle Boy, I think he goes by on social media, right? Still, this would maintain a suspicious eye. Some details start to emerge that could possibly paint the picture of a police cover-up. Like there are some things that don't add up about the prosecution's theory. As I already mentioned, experts seem to think his body didn't look like it was hit by a car. Also, about 12 people were supposedly at the Albert's house the night he died. So why didn't anyone see O'Keefe's body as they were leaving? Great question. One of his shoes were supposedly found 50 feet from his body, which seems really unusual for a hit and run. His body was also found 12 feet away from the curb, which in itself is possibly strange. Would have been atop a layer of snow, so would have been pretty visible. But a plow driver, and I think the plow driver's name went by something Lucky Loughran, I believe. Anyway, interesting guy. The plow driver, a different witness, both said they didn't see any bodies in the front yard that night. Although they did both claim to have seen the home. Just a sec here, everyone. To have seen the home. Oh, and then it says her car is basically fine, meaning Karen Reid's car, the SUV, and there's very little damage to indicate she would have hit a person, besides a broken taillight. More on that later. And when witnesses plus video evidence suggest that the pair was happy and laughing that night. Although I guess the voicemail she left on his phone suggests otherwise. Spurious, but also worth mentioning, is the fact that O'Keefe iPhone data suggests he walked up several flights of stairs after Reid dropped him off, although that data seems less than perfectly reliable. There's also the weird behavior by the Alberts and other cops. Apparently, a police officer left the party at 1:30 a.m. to go to the police department, and that was Brian Higgins, where he said he was doing administration work. By the way, I don't trust Brian Higgins, my friends, at all. Did he possibly beat up John O'Keefe because he was jealous of John O'Keefe? Because again, my friends, we know, those of you that are already familiar with this case in a big way, Brian Higgins was undoubtedly jealous, right? He wanted to date or have intimate relations with Karen Reid, and Karen Reid was sexting, flirting with Brian Higgins, right? And Brian Higgins had the audacity to text Karen in the bar behind John O'Keefe's back when they're all in a bar together, right? Karen, Brian Higgins, John O'Keefe, Brian Albert, and other cops. This is Brian Higgins' behavior, my friends. And he was drunk, too. The guy acted so immature. But anyway, did Brian Higgins, in fact, beat up John? Hit him with a weapon or push him on the ground, throw him on the ground, and poor, John O'Keefe, that's how he got the skull fracture, hitting his head on the pavement? We don't know. Was it in the garage? Did it take place? Did the assault happen in Brian Albert's basement with Brian Higgins? We don't know, my friends. I still think it's a little bit far-stretched to think that, Brian Higgins had the opportunity to have a fight with John O'Keefe instead of the alternative where, I think it's more likely, anyways, that Karen Reid unfortunately backed up by an accident, most likely, and clipped John O'Keefe and hit him, my friends. Okay? But that's where I'm leaning towards right now. So, again, let me see here. There's also the weird behavior, again, by the Alberts and other cops. Apparently, a police officer left the party at 1:30 a.m. This is Brian Higgins, again, going to the police department where he said he was doing administration work. At 1:30 a.m. on a Saturday, when you've been partying? ? Yeah, it's very strange. Okay, that's when the Alberts were alerted to the fact that there was a dead body in the front yard the next morning. They never came out of the house? ? I know. That's what's so crazy about this case too, my friends, right? The Alberts never came out of the house. Crazy, Brian Albert. Shortly after the incident, they gave away their dog that they had, and they had their basement redone, as I said earlier, my friends, and they put their house on the market, which could be a coincidence, which I said earlier too, my friends, but not for Karen Reid's attorney. It seems like one of the main things that got the defense interested is that the person in charge of the investigation, Michael Proctor, apparently knew the Alberts, pretty well, He knew the Alberts pretty well, although both Proctor, excuse me, and the Alberts, apparently the Proctor apparently knew the Alberts pretty well, and although both Proctor and the Alberts deny this, soon Reed's defense attorney starts to wonder about the way the collection of evidence was handled. Camera footage around the Alberts house, which would, excuse me, which would normally clarify what happened that night, is missing for the hours where it would be relevant. The police chief of Canton PD actually lives across the street from the Brian Alberts home, and his camera could have definitely helped us figure out what happened. That footage is for some reason not available. Interesting. Certain witness statements were intentionally left out of the report, like from one witness who said he saw Karen Reed drop John O'Keefe off and said that there was no damage to the car when she was alone. Interesting. When she was alone in it. And there's some weird inconsistencies in the reports of the state trooper in charge, Michael Proctor. By the way, my friends, Michael Proctor said the most hideous names, calling Karen Reed these terrible, terrible names in text messages to I forget who he texted, but unbelievable. I won't even tell you the names that he called Karen Reed, my friends, right now. It's unbelievable. You can look it up yourself. It's just disgusting. Michael Proctor's a despicable man. He should never have said that, especially when you're a man in uniform and you're involved in an investigation. If not, you shouldn't be calling any woman these names, in my opinion. And everybody should know that. But anyway, let's go on here, my friends. Where were we? And there were weird inconsistencies, like the investigation report that was made available to Karen Reed's team was significantly different from the original and left out a bunch of evidence that would either exculpate or would exculpate Reed or possibly incriminate the police. And the fragment of Reed's taillight, which is supposedly proves that she had hit something, wasn't found until hours after the scene had been processed. And Reed's car had been in their custody. Why did they go back after they had already, for nearly 2 hours, were combing the snow for evidence? The taillight was found on top of the bank of snow, but it had snowed almost 6 inches that night, mostly after the time Karen Reed's would have left. So why was it on top of the snowbank? And they don't have much to anchor this piece of evidence to the truth. What was the defense Was the defense trying to subpoena police reports and logs or photos of the taillight? There was none. I hope I read that right, everyone. So we're almost finished here. Let me just see here. One more. As this person is writing, some of the more zealous Karen Reed defenders like Adian Carney, again that Turtle Boy character, says claims that there's evidence that this piece of plastic didn't come from her car at all. There are other theories of her taillight was broken, possibly by backing into a different car on her way to look for her boyfriend, which video evidence does capture her doing. Although this is enough for the defense attorney to get a hold of the phone owned by Jennifer McCabe, who was there that night and who is Brian Albert's sister-in-law. Turns out Jen McCabe had Googled how long to die in cold at 2:27 a.m., way before she helped Karen Reed locate John O'Keefe's body at 6 a.m. For her part, McCabe says she actually Googled that when they found the body at 6 a.m., and the timestamp's just a glitch. And they went on and on, right, with the IT experts, one or two for the defense. They had an IT expert, one or two for the prosecution, and they went round and around. You know, the prosecution's trying to show that, I don't know, some sort of way the Google windows opened when Jennifer McCabe did one of her Google searches, and then it went back, and that's why it showed how long to die in cold. Anyway, it gets very convoluted, everyone. You'd have to watch the trial or, read more of these thread posts, but I'm trying to do the best I can for you here, everyone. So the big question is, and it's very fascinating, right? Did Jennifer McCabe, did she in fact Google at 2:27 a.m., like the timestamp says, Haas long to die in the cold? Because if she did, then we all know that means Jen McCabe is involved in a big conspiracy to have killed, to know about John O'Keefe's death, right? Most likely from Higgins or Brian Albert. So very, very important information here, my friends. John O'Keefe's body, it says here, turns out Jen McCabe had Googled, Haas long to die in cold at 2:27 a.m., way before she helped Karen Reed relocate John O'Keefe's body at 6 a.m. For her part, McCabe says she actually Googled that when she found the body at 6 a.m., and the timestamp's just a glitch. But she had also inexplicably searched about hypothermia, which is a weird thing to search if you're not trying to cover up a murder, right? Like most of this case, it feels like something could be insignificant or something I'm reading into. She also deleted a ton of texts and calls from Brian Albert that night, which is not something I would do unless I'm basically shady. She was apparently on her phone basically all night, so she didn't sleep that night. And even though the prosecution supposedly had done a full forensic search of her phone, none of this evidence was turned to the defense. The defense came up with a theory about what happened that night, which holds that O'Keefe did make it into the house, and that while there, he either got attacked by a dog, was punched in the face by Brian Albert's, in the first trial, they tried to say he was punched in the face possibly by Brian Albert's nephew, which I don't believe happened, my friends, even though he was an 18-year-old punk by and large, the way he acted. But there's no evidence that, this 18-year-old nephew had any motive to try to, punch John O'Keefe in the face. The nephew, 18-year-old Colin Albert, was indeed at the Alberts' house last night and apparently had a bad relationship with John O'Keefe, although it sounds like the beef, again, just really boils down to go fuck yourself and some littering Keefe's, front yard. But this was enough for people like Aidan Kearney to start looking closely. In a photo from shortly after O'Keefe's died, Colin had scrapes and bruises on his knuckles, which he thinks is evidence that he was possibly in a physical fight but with someone in the weeks prior. Colin seems to be a rascal who isn't super polite and maybe doesn't have so much respect for the rules or social contract. And it's reasonable to think that he doesn't get into trouble, because his father, uncle, and a few other people in his family have close circles or are police officers. So the theory holds that John O'Keefe is murdered in the Albert household. The 12 people inside the house conspire with each other and force law enforcement agents to cover up O'Keefe's death. When Jennifer McCabe and Karen Reed look for the body, she does so basically with the intention of inserting the idea that Karen would have killed O'Keefe herself. A lot of this seems just like speculation that sadly wasn't going to lead to anywhere, but then the DOJ got involved and launched a federal probe. So I thought that was really interesting, my friends. I hope you do find a lot of this information as well. And finally, my friends, I'll just say also it says, for those who support Brennan, meaning the prosecutor, and think he's done a great job prosecuting this case, what are your thoughts on the x-rays? Oh yeah, this is another article, my friends. Somebody else writing about the x-rays. Again, the x-rays show no broken bones, my friends, at least in terms of the pelvis or right hand, right arm of John O'Keefe, where those injuries we saw, happen. Given that the right arm, no one was, anyway, I've explained that already. So there you go, my friends. What do you think? Here's my question to all of you out there, of course, and thank you for listening, about the Karen Reed trial, right, with John O'Keefe. Poor John O'Keefe, my friends. How tragic, how sad. This man should never have died like this. Just an absolute terrible way to end, and he died too young, my friends. And it is what it is, unfortunately. And again, to all of you out there trying to get justice ultimately for John O'Keefe, I commend you. And if Karen Reid if she truly didn't hit John O'Keefe, then obviously she had nothing to do with the crime and she's completely innocent. And if that's the case, then she deserves justice too, my friends, in her own way, right? But I tend to think if I were a betting man, I think it's more likely, unfortunately, that Karen did hit John O'Keefe. But you guys and gals can agree to disagree. Feel free to leave me a comment again, everyone. I will read them. I appreciate your time today. This is about the Karen Reid case, and it's a huge international case, basically, particularly in the United States, my friends. Boston, Massachusetts, but everywhere almost across America now, right? Huge story, because it's a fascinating, crazy, wild case. Anyway, thank you, everyone. I go by ESTEY'S Crime Maze again. If you think I have value to share with humanity, if you enjoy my videos, I hope you subscribe. I hope you smash that like button. Hit that bell icon. And again, feel free to leave me a comment. I read them. Appreciate that engagement. Till next time, everyone. Have a beautiful morning, afternoon, and or evening, wherever you are. I'm out. Bye.